Sometimes the smallest act of kindness changes the life of the person who gives it more than the person who receives it. Rain hammered the streets of Chicago with relentless force, turning sidewalks into rivers of reflected city lights. Most people hurried past with umbrellas tilted against the wind, focused only on reaching their destinations before the storm grew worse. Cars splashed through puddles. Bus engines rumbled in the distance. Storefronts glowed warmly against the gray afternoon. Near a weathered bus stop on the edge of the city's south side, 12-year-old Zoe Mitchell adjusted the strap of her backpack and pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders. School had ended nearly an hour earlier, but she was in no rush to go home. Before returning to the small apartment she shared with her grandmother, she needed to stop by a grocery store to pick up a few items and then help prepare dinner. It was a routine she followed every day. At 12 years old, Zoe had responsibilities most children never thought about. Yet she carried them quietly, without complaint. As she approached the bus shelter, something unusual caught her attention. A man sat alone on the bench beneath the leaking roof. He appeared to be in his late 50s, dressed in an expensive dark overcoat now soaked by the rain. A leather briefcase rested beside him. Most people walking past barely glanced in his direction. Some assumed he was simply waiting for transportation. Others never noticed him at all. Zoe slowed her pace. There was something wrong. The man was staring downward, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed strangely out of place. More importantly, he looked lost. Not physically lost, emotionally lost. The kind of loneliness that remained visible no matter how much money someone possessed. Zoe hesitated. Her grandmother often reminded her to be careful around strangers. But she also taught her something else. If someone needs help and you can help safely, you should. Taking a deep breath, Zoe stepped beneath the shelter. "Sir?" she asked gently. The man looked up. His eyes seemed surprised that anyone had spoken to him. "Are you okay?" For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then a faint smile appeared. "That is an interesting question." Zoe sat at the opposite end of the bench. Rain drummed against the metal roof overhead. "Most people say yes or no." The man chuckled softly. "Most people are not asking." Something about the answer made Zoe smile. "Well, I am asking." The man glanced toward the rain-covered street before answering. "I suppose I am having a difficult day." Zoe nodded as though she understood completely. "Those happen." Again, he seemed surprised. Adults often dismiss children. Zoe noticed it all the time. Yet this man looked as if her opinion genuinely mattered. "Do they?" he asked. "Sure," she replied. "My grandmother says everybody carries something heavy. You just cannot always see it." The man stared at her for several seconds. The words seemed to settle somewhere deep inside him. Neither spoke for a moment. Traffic continued flowing through the storm. People hurried past without noticing the unlikely conversation unfolding at the bus stop. Finally, the man extended his hand. "My name is Charles Whitmore." Zoe shook it politely. "I am Zoe." Neither of them knew it yet, but beneath that leaking bus shelter on a rainy Chicago afternoon, a chance encounter had just begun, a journey that would change both of their lives forever. Rain continued to pour across the city, drumming against the roof of the bus shelter as evening slowly approached. The streets had become a blur of headlights and reflections, turning the gray afternoon into a watercolor of moving lights and shadows. Zoe Mitchell sat quietly on the bench beside Charles Whitmore, her backpack resting at her feet. Their conversation drifted naturally from one topic to another. Charles found himself surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. Most adults spent time trying to impress him, negotiate with him, or ask him for something. Zoe did none of those things. She simply listened. After several minutes, a low growl interrupted the conversation. Zoe immediately looked away, embarrassed. Charles realized the sound had come from her stomach. "Have you eaten lunch today?" he asked gently. Zoe hesitated. "Sort of." The answer told him everything. Charles opened his briefcase and searched for something, but found nothing except documents and electronic devices. Before he could say anything else, Zoe reached into her backpack and pulled out a small paper bag. She carefully unwrapped a sandwich that had clearly been prepared hours earlier. It was simple, just bread, turkey, and a little cheese. Nothing special. Yet she held it as though it were valuable. Charles noticed the way her eyes lingered on it for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she extended it toward him. "Here." Charles blinked. "What is this?" "My sandwich." "Why are you giving it to me?" Zoe shrugged. You look like you need it. Charles stared at the sandwich in disbelief. Zoe, this is your dinner, is it not? She looked down at the floor. Maybe. Then absolutely not. You should take it. And what will you eat? Again she shrugged. I will figure something out. The simplicity of the answer struck him harder than he expected. Throughout his career, Charles had attended dinners costing thousands of dollars per plate. He had eaten in luxury restaurants around the world. Yet he could not remember the last time anyone had offered him something that mattered this much. Because this sandwich represented sacrifice, Zoe was not sharing abundance. She was sharing scarcity. She was offering the only thing she had. Why would you do that for a stranger? He asked quietly. Zoe thought for a moment before answering. Because if somebody is having a hard day, maybe they need help more than I do. Charles looked away toward the rain-covered street. Suddenly, the storm outside seemed far less heavy than the emotion building inside his chest. For years, he had measured value through numbers. Profits, assets, acquisitions. Yet a 12-year-old girl sitting beside him had just demonstrated a kind of wealth no financial statement could measure. My grandmother says kindness works like planting seeds, Zoe continued. You might never see what grows, but that does not mean it is not important. Charles smiled faintly. Your grandmother sounds very wise. She is. Zoe carefully placed the sandwich into his hands before he could refuse. Again. Besides, she would be upset if I did not help. For a long moment, neither spoke. Charles stared at the sandwich while rainwater slid down the shelter windows. People continued rushing past without noticing the small act of generosity unfolding only a few feet away. Finally, he took a bite. Not because he was hungry, because refusing would have dishonored the gift. Zoe smiled when she saw him eating. It was the kind of smile that expected nothing in return. And as Charles sat beneath the leaking bus shelter, holding the simplest meal he had ever received, he realized he had just encountered something far rarer than success. He had encountered genuine kindness. The rain showed no sign of stopping. Water streamed down the glass walls of the bus shelter, while traffic moved slowly through the evening streets. Yet neither Zoe Mitchell nor Charles Whitmore seemed eager to leave. What had begun as a chance encounter now felt strangely important. Charles finished the last bite of the sandwich and carefully folded the paper wrapper. For reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself wanting the conversation to continue. So, he said, leaning back against the bench, what do you do when you are not rescuing strangers at bus stops? Zoe laughed softly. I do not usually rescue strangers. Then what do you usually do? She adjusted her backpack and thought for a moment. Homework. Reading. Helping my grandmother. Things like that. Reading what? Charles asked. Zoe's eyes immediately brightened. It was the first time all afternoon that she looked completely carefree. Everything. That is a very large category. I know. She smiled. History books. Science books. Biographies. Sometimes novels. Whatever I can borrow from the library. Charles raised an eyebrow. Most 12-year-olds spend their free time on their phones. Phones are expensive. The answer came so naturally that it took him a moment to process it. Zoe did not sound bitter. She was simply stating a fact. Besides, she continued, books can take you places without buying a plane ticket. Charles found himself laughing. I like that. It is true. She pointed toward her backpack. I am reading about Abraham Lincoln right now. Why Lincoln? Because he failed a lot before he succeeded. Charles smiled. That is one way to describe him. People always talk about successful people like they were special from the beginning. Zoe looked out toward the rain. But most of them struggled first. The observation caught him off guard. You think about things like that? All the time. Charles studied her carefully. There was a maturity in her words that seemed far older than 12. What do you want to be when you grow up? He asked. Most children answered that question immediately. Zoe did not. Instead, she thought about it seriously. I want to help people. Charles smiled. That is very noble. No, she shook her head. I mean, I really want to help people. He waited for her to continue. There are kids at school who are smart, but nobody notices. There are families in my neighborhood who work hard every day and still struggle. Sometimes it feels like people only pay attention to those who already have advantages. Her voice remained calm, but the conviction behind it was impossible to miss. I think everybody deserves a chance. Charles looked away for a moment. In boardrooms and executive meetings, he regularly listened to highly educated people discuss social issues, economic systems, and opportunity. Yet few spoke with the clarity sitting beside him on that bus stop bench. "You know," he said quietly, "you are probably one of the smartest people I have met in a very long time." Zoe immediately laughed. "That is impossible." "Why?" "Because you probably know important people." Charles smiled to himself. If only she knew. Maybe. Then they are probably smarter than me. Not necessarily. Zoe shook her head. "My grandmother says intelligence is not how much you know. It is how much you are willing to learn." Charles stared at her. Once again, she had managed to say something that felt both simple and profound. As the rain continued falling outside, he realized he was no longer speaking to a child the way adults often did. He was speaking to a remarkable young person whose wisdom seemed to appear in every sentence. And for the first time that day, Charles found himself wondering not what Zoe might become someday, but what obstacles had forced someone so young to grow up so quickly. The rain had softened into a steady drizzle by the time the distant headlights of an approaching bus appeared through the gray evening haze. Yet neither Zoe Mitchell nor Charles Whitmore seemed eager for the conversation to end. What had begun as a simple exchange between strangers now felt strangely significant to both of them. The bus slowed near the curb, but Zoe remained seated. "That is not your bus?" Charles asked. Zoe shook her head. "No, mine comes later." The doors closed, and the vehicle disappeared down the street. For a few moments, only the sound of rain filled the silence between them. Then Charles asked a question he had been wondering about for quite some time. "Who is at home waiting for you?" Zoe's smile softened immediately. "My grandmother." "Just the two of you?" She nodded. "It has been that way for a long time." Charles noticed the careful way she chose her words. Children usually answered questions directly. Zoe seemed to weigh each response before giving it. "Your grandmother must be very proud of you." Zoe looked down at her hands. "I hope so." "You do not know? Sometimes I worry that I should be doing more." Charles frowned slightly. "More? Helping more around the apartment? Studying harder? Earning more money after school?" The answer caught him completely off guard. "Zoe, you are 12. She offered a small shrug. "Bills do not care how old you are." For a moment, Charles could not find the right words. He had spent years attending meetings where adults complained about minor inconveniences while sitting in luxury offices. Yet here was a child speaking about responsibility with a seriousness most executives never displayed. "What do you do after school?" he asked quietly. "Whatever I can." She smiled faintly. "I help neighbors carry groceries sometimes. I organize books at the library on weekends. I tutor younger kids when they need help with homework. And then you take care of your grandmother." "Of course." The answer came instantly, as though there had never been another option. Charles felt a weight settling inside his chest. Looking at Zoe, he suddenly realized that the maturity he admired had not appeared by accident. It had been earned through necessity. She had grown up faster than she should have. The realization saddened him more than he expected. Rainwater slid slowly down the shelter windows. Outside, the city continued moving as if nothing extraordinary were happening. Yet for Charles, everything felt different. He turned toward her. "Zoe." "Yes." His voice softened. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded. Charles hesitated briefly before leaning slightly closer. The words that followed were almost a whisper. No child should have to carry the weight of an entire family. For a second, Zoe remained completely still. Then her expression changed. The brave smile she had worn throughout the afternoon disappeared. Her eyes filled with tears. She quickly looked away, embarrassed. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I do not usually cry." Charles immediately regretted making her emotional. But then he realized something important. She was not crying because he had hurt her feelings. She was crying because someone had finally noticed. For hours, Zoe had spoken about helping others, about solving problems, about being responsible. Yet no one had stopped to acknowledge how much she carried herself. She wiped her eyes and laughed nervously. "My grandmother always says I am stronger than I think." Charles smiled gently. Maybe she is right. Zoe nodded, but fresh tears appeared anyway. And sitting beneath that weathered bus shelter on a rainy Chicago evening, surrounded by the noise of a city that never stopped moving, a little girl who spent her life taking care of everyone else experienced something she rarely received herself. Understanding. Not long after Zoe's bus finally arrived, the two strangers parted ways. Charles Whitmore watched through the rain-streaked window as the bus carried her toward the south side. her small figure disappearing into the glow of city lights. For several moments, he remained standing beneath the shelter, holding the memory of the conversation as if it were something fragile. Then a black sedan pulled to the curb. The driver stepped out immediately. "Mr. Whitmore, we have been trying to reach you for hours." Charles nodded distractedly and climbed inside. Normally, he would have spent the ride reviewing reports or preparing for meetings. That night, however, he stared out the window in silence. He could not stop thinking about Zoe. The sandwich, the books, the responsibilities she carried without complaint. Most of all, he could not forget the tears that appeared when someone finally acknowledged how heavy her burden had become. The next morning, Charles arrived at the headquarters of Whitmore Logistics, a glass tower overlooking downtown Chicago. Executives filled conference rooms. Assistants hurried through hallways. Market reports covered conference tables. Yet despite the demands waiting for him, his thoughts kept returning to the 12-year-old girl from the bus stop. By afternoon, curiosity became concern. He called his longtime chief of staff, Margaret Ellis. "I need a favor." Margaret looked surprised. "Of course." Charles hesitated. "There is a young girl I met yesterday." One eyebrow immediately rose. "A student? That sounds much better." Margaret laughed softly. "What do you need?" Charles explained the situation. "Not every detail. Just enough. I want to know whether she is doing all right." Within a few days, information began to arrive. Charles reviewed the file alone in his office. The first pages described Zoe Mitchell's academic record. Straight A's, outstanding attendance, exceptional test scores. Teachers consistently described her as gifted, responsible, and remarkably mature. Charles smiled as he read. None of that surprised him. Then he continued. The smile faded. Zoe's grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, suffered from ongoing health challenges that limited her ability to work. Their apartment was small. Their finances were strained. Several community organizations had quietly assisted them over the years. Despite everything, Zoe maintained top grades while helping manage household responsibilities far beyond what most children experienced. Charles set the file down and stared at the city skyline outside his office. The facts confirmed what he had already sensed. Zoe was not extraordinary because she endured hardship. She was extraordinary because she remained kind despite it. Another page caught his attention. It contained a note from one of her teachers. If given proper educational opportunities, this student could compete with the best scholars in the country. Charles read the sentence twice, then a third time. Slowly, an idea began forming. Not charity, opportunity. There was a difference. Zoe possessed talent, discipline, and character. What she lacked were resources. Charles knew firsthand how dramatically a single opportunity could alter the course of a life. He closed the file and made a decision. Somewhere across Chicago, Zoe was likely finishing homework at a kitchen table while helping her grandmother prepare dinner. She had no idea that a conversation beneath a rainy bus shelter had stayed with someone far more than she realized. And she certainly had no idea that the quiet act of kindness she offered a stranger was about to open a door neither of them had expected. 2 weeks passed before Zoe Mitchell saw Charles Whitmore again. Life had returned to its familiar routine. School during the day, homework in the evening, trips to the grocery store, caring for her grandmother. The rainy afternoon at the bus stop had become a pleasant memory, but nothing more. At least that was what she believed. One Thursday afternoon, Zoe arrived home carrying a library book and a bag of groceries. The small apartment smelled of soup. Her grandmother sat near the window, knitting while soft jazz music played from an old radio. "You have a letter," Eleanor Mitchell said with a smile. Zoe looked surprised. "For me? That is what it says." Most 12-year-olds rarely received mail addressed specifically to them. Curious, Zoe placed her backpack on the floor and examined the envelope. The return address belonged to a foundation she had never heard of. Carefully, she opened it. As she unfolded the letter, her eyes widened. Then she read it again. And again. "Grandma." Eleanor immediately noticed the expression on her face. "What is it?" Zoe handed her the paper. The letter announced that she had been selected for a highly competitive academic enrichment program designed for exceptional students throughout Illinois. The program included advanced courses, mentorship opportunities, transportation assistance, educational materials, and full financial support. Zoe stared at the page as if it might disappear. There has to be some mistake. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and continued reading. Slowly, a smile spread across her face. I do not think there is. Over the following days, additional information arrived. Program schedules, orientation materials, welcome packages. Everything appeared legitimate. Teachers at Zoe's school were equally surprised and delighted. Several admitted that opportunities like this rarely became available to students from their neighborhood. Yet despite the excitement, one question continued bothering Zoe. Why her? The answer arrived the following Saturday. During orientation at a university campus outside Chicago, dozens of talented students gathered with their families. Professors introduced themselves. Advisors discussed future opportunities. Representatives from educational organizations greeted participants. As Zoe explored the campus, she suddenly froze. Standing near the entrance of a conference hall was Charles Whitmore. He appeared just as surprised to see her. Mr. Whitmore? Zoe asked. Charles smiled warmly. Hello, Zoe. She hurried toward him. What are you doing here? Attending the orientation. Why? Charles laughed softly. That is a reasonable question. Before he could answer, a university administrator approached. Mr. Whitmore, thank you again for supporting this year's program. Zoe's eyes widened immediately. She looked from the administrator back to Charles. Understanding slowly began to form. You knew about this. Charles nodded. I helped create it. Zoe stared at him in disbelief. For me, not only for you. His voice remained gentle. For students like you. They found a quiet place to sit beneath a row of oak trees overlooking the campus lawn. Students and families moved through the pathways nearby. Charles explained that years earlier he had established educational initiatives for talented young people facing financial obstacles. After meeting Zoe, he had expanded those efforts significantly. You did not just help me, she said quietly. No, Charles smiled. You reminded me what matters. For a moment, neither spoke. A breeze carried fallen leaves across the grass. Finally, Zoe looked down at the orientation folder resting in her lap. I do not know how to thank you. Charles shook his head. You already did. She looked confused. When? The day you sat beside a stranger in the rain when everyone else walked away. Zoe smiled softly. And for the first time since receiving the mysterious letter, she began to understand that kindness has a way of returning when we least expect it. The years that followed transformed Zoe Mitchell's life in ways she could never have imagined during that rainy afternoon at the bus stop. The academic program opened doors that once seemed impossibly far away. For the first time, she found herself surrounded by students who shared her love of learning. She attended advanced classes on university campuses, participated in leadership workshops, and met mentors who encouraged her to dream bigger than she ever had before. Yet despite the new opportunities, some things never changed. She still lived with her grandmother. She still spent evenings helping around the apartment. She still visited the neighborhood library every week. Most importantly, she never lost the kindness that had defined her long before anyone noticed her potential. Charles Whitmore remained part of her life as well, though never in the way people might have expected. He did not try to control her future. He did not make decisions for her. Instead, he became something far more valuable. A guide, a listener, a source of encouragement whenever challenges appeared. Every few months, they met for lunch, usually at a small restaurant near the university where Zoe attended enrichment programs. Their conversations rarely focused on money or success. Instead, they discussed books, ideas, goals, and the kind of person Zoe hoped to become. By the time she entered high school, her achievements had become impossible to ignore. She earned top grades, won academic competitions, led community service projects. Teachers described her as one of the most promising students they had ever taught. Yet what impressed Charles most was not her intelligence. It was her character. Whenever new students entered a program feeling nervous or out of place, Zoe was the first to welcome them. Whenever someone struggled academically, she offered help. She remembered exactly what it felt like to be overlooked and made sure others never felt invisible around her. One afternoon during her junior year of high school, Zoe received extraordinary news. She had been selected as a finalist for one of the most prestigious scholarship programs in the country. The award would provide a full college education along with leadership training and research opportunities. Excitement swept through her school. Teachers celebrated. Friends congratulated her. Even local newspapers expressed interest in her story. Yet on the evening before her final interview, anxiety crept in. Sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and preparation materials, she suddenly felt overwhelmed. What if she was not good enough? What if everyone expected too much? Her grandmother listened quietly before picking up an old photograph. The picture showed Zoe as a child standing beside a bus stop on a rainy day. "Do you remember this?" Eleanor asked. Zoe smiled immediately. Of course. That little girl did not stop to help someone because she expected a reward. Her grandmother placed the photograph on the table. She helped because it was the right thing to do. Zoe looked at the image for a long moment. I know. Then nothing important has changed. The next day, she walked into the scholarship interview with calm confidence. Weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. Full scholarship, complete funding, a future filled with possibility. As tears of happiness filled her eyes, Zoe realized something remarkable. The opportunities surrounding her now were not simply changing her life. They were allowing her to become more fully the person she had always been destined to become. 8 years later, sunlight poured across the campus of one of the nation's most respected universities. Thousands of graduates dressed in black gowns filled rows of seats stretching across the enormous outdoor ceremony grounds. Families waved from the stands. Cameras flashed. Excited conversations drifted through the warm spring air. It was graduation day. At 20 years old, Zoe Mitchell sat among the top students in her class. The same little girl who once carried groceries through the rain and worried about paying bills now prepared to receive honors for academic excellence, leadership, and community service. Yet despite the remarkable journey that had brought her there, she remained unmistakably herself. Her smile was still humble, her gratitude still genuine, and her determination to help others remained stronger than ever. Seated in the audience several rows from the stage, Charles Whitmore watched quietly. His hair had grown grayer over the years, but his eyes held the same warmth they carried on the afternoon they first met. Beside him sat Eleanor Mitchell. Though older now, she looked healthier and happier than she had in years. The two had developed a friendship built on mutual respect and admiration for the young woman they both loved dearly. She did this herself, Eleanor said softly as graduates prepared to walk across the stage. Charles smiled. She certainly did. The ceremony began. Student after student received degrees while proud families applauded. Finally, the university president stepped to the podium. Before we conclude today's celebration, he announced, we would like to recognize this year's student commencement speaker. Cheers erupted throughout the audience. A scholar, leader, mentor, and advocate for educational access, please welcome Zoe Mitchell. Applause thundered across the grounds as Zoe approached the microphone. Looking out across thousands of faces, she paused briefly. The moment felt overwhelming. Yet instead of nervousness, she felt gratitude. Good afternoon, she began. Her voice carried clearly across the ceremony field. People often ask successful graduates what inspired them. They expect stories about achievement, ambition, or talent. She smiled gently. My story begins at a bus stop. Curious laughter rippled through the audience. Zoe continued. She spoke about kindness, responsibility, community. She described how one small decision can change a life. She never mentioned wealth. She never spoke about status. Instead, she focused on human connection. The most important opportunities in my life did not arrive because someone felt sorry for me, she said. They arrived because someone believed in me before success made that belief easy. Silence settled across the crowd. Many listeners wiped tears from their eyes. Charles lowered his gaze briefly, deeply moved. Then Zoe looked toward the audience and smiled. Years ago, someone reminded me that no child should have to carry the weight of an entire family alone. Emotion filled her voice. Those words changed me because they were the first time someone saw what I was carrying. The audience listened in complete silence. Today, I hope every person here remembers something important. Never underestimate the power of noticing someone. Sometimes encouragement changes a life more than opportunity ever could. As she finished speaking, thousands of people rose to their feet. The standing ovation seemed endless. Zoe stood beneath the bright afternoon sky surrounded by applause, yet her eyes searched only one section of the crowd. When she finally found Charles and her grandmother standing together, both smiling proudly, she realized that the journey begun on a rainy Chicago afternoon had led exactly where it was meant to go. And although the ceremony celebrated academic achievement, the greatest lesson of all had nothing to do with grades. It had everything to do with kindness. The graduation ceremony ended beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold and blue. Families gathered across the campus lawn, taking photographs and celebrating milestones years in the making. Laughter drifted through the warm afternoon air. Graduates embraced parents, grandparents, teachers, and friends. Yet among the thousands of conversations taking place, one reunion felt especially meaningful. Zoe Mitchell stepped down from the stage and immediately made her way through the crowd. Her grandmother reached her first, wrapping her in a proud embrace. Neither woman needed many words. The tears in their eyes said enough. After a moment, Zoe turned toward Charles Whitmore. For several seconds, they simply looked at one another, both remembering a rainy afternoon that felt impossibly distant now. "You did it," Charles said softly. Zoe smiled. "We did it." He shook his head. "No, you earned every step yourself." The three of them spent the afternoon together, sharing stories and celebrating the achievement. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Charles invited them to a small reception hosted by one of the university's scholarship partners. During the event, professors, community leaders, and former students spoke about the importance of opportunity. Listening to them, Zoe felt grateful for every person who had helped shape her journey. Then, near the end of the evening, Charles asked if he could show her something. Curious, she followed him to a quiet room adjacent to the reception hall. On a table rested several folders and photographs. "What is this?" she asked. Charles smiled. "A story I should have told you years ago." He opened one of the folders. Inside were records from a charitable housing assistance program created more than a decade earlier. Zoe studied the documents without understanding. Then she noticed a familiar name. Eleanor Mitchell. Her grandmother. Confused, she looked up. Charles nodded gently. "Many years before we met, your grandmother received help through a community fund my company supported." Zoe stared at him in disbelief. "What are you saying?" "I am saying our lives crossed paths long before that day at the bus stop." He explained that during a difficult period, the program had quietly helped families avoid losing stable housing. Eleanor had been one of them. Neither she nor Zoe had ever known who funded the initiative. Silence filled the room. Zoe looked through the documents again. Suddenly, the story felt larger than she had ever imagined. The connection between them had begun years before either realized it. Tears filled her eyes. "So all this time," Charles smiled, "life was connecting dots neither of us could see." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Zoe stepped forward and embraced him. It was not the embrace of someone thanking a benefactor. It was the embrace of family, the kind built through trust, respect, and years of shared growth. As the evening drew to a close, they stepped outside together. The campus was quiet now. Most graduates had already departed. Warm lights glowed along the pathways. Zoe looked toward the horizon and smiled. "Do you know something?" she asked. "What?" Charles replied. "That sandwich was probably the best investment either of us ever made." Charles laughed. "I think you might be right." They continued walking beneath the evening sky, accompanied by Eleanor's gentle laughter. And as they disappeared down the path together, it became clear that the most extraordinary part of their story was never about money, scholarships, or success. It was about kindness. One simple act of kindness offered by a little girl who had very little to give had created a chain of hope, opportunity, and love that changed countless lives. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest miracles, and sometimes the people we help end up helping us far more than we ever expected.